Blessings upon you today. Welcome to our Cornerstone Word for the week, our Bible and Sunday School study for the upcoming Sunday. I pray you had a good week already, and pray the Lord's blessings upon you for the remainder of the week. I'm super excited about our study today. It's out of the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and today we're looking at verses 18 through 31. That's 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter to the Corinthian church that he founded, by the way. Years earlier, they had gotten into some contentious ways and divisive attitudes, and Paul received word of it, and so he goes back to address them and to try to get them back on track. So 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 31 is what we want to focus for a few minutes on today. If you have to title it, if you're following the International Sunday School lesson curriculum, it would be entitled The Resume of Those Called. The Resume of Those Called. Of course, the church at Corinth was in the city of Corinth, under Roman rule and within Roman culture. Roman culture at that time put much emphasis on wisdom, philosophy, philosophers, and all of that had crept into the church, and it had begun causing divisive ways even within the family of believers. Paul wants to address it. Says, in essence, there's nothing wrong with being wise, but please understand you ought not mistake worldly wisdom for godly wisdom. There is a difference when you read verses 6 through 12 or so of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. You'll discover that the divisiveness had become so bad that some had even begun almost to worship those who baptized them. They had gone to making stars of their ministers. Listen to what Paul says. Paul says, in verse 12 of chapter 1, he says, now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, or I am of Apollos, or I of Cephas. He said, but really you all ought to be saying, I am of Christ. No matter who baptized you, you're not a Paulian, you're not a Cephasian, you're not an Apolloian. You ought to be trying to be a Christian. But the people had gotten so off track. Paul says, is Christ divided? And he tries to really emphasize. He says, well, listen. He says, well, was Paul crucified for you? Yeah. So he said, no, don't get so caught up on who you were baptized by. You weren't baptized in our name. You weren't baptized in the name of Paul. You should have been baptized in the name of Christ. And it is he who is at the forefront and the center of our faith and our redemption. And so let's pick up on it, verses 18 and 19. And what Paul is showing us is that we ought not mistake worldly wisdom for godly wisdom, for God will bring down worldly wisdom that sees the gospel of Jesus Christ as foolishness. Let me see if I can give you a couple of versions of that, verse 18 and 19. King James Version says again, of course, that for the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. I like the way the Messenger translation puts these verses. The Messenger translation says, The message that points to Christ on the cross seems like sheer silliness to those hell-bent on destruction. But for those on the way of salvation, it makes perfect sense. This is the way God works, and most powerfully, as it turns out, it's written. I'll turn conventional wisdom on its head. I'll expose so-called experts as shams. Matter of fact, it goes on to say, so where can you find someone truly wise, truly educated, truly intelligent in this day and age? Hasn't God exposed it all as pretentious nonsense? Since the world and all its fancy wisdom never had a clue when it came to knowing God. God in his wisdom took delight in using what the world considered stupid, preaching of all things, to bring those who trust him into the way of salvation. Wow. King James Version puts that 21st verse in this light. It says, for after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. What an intriguing message. What an intriguing word Paul puts forth here. He talks about what real wisdom really is. It's okay to go to school. Matter of fact, everybody ought to go to school, get all the education you can get. But know that in addition to worldly wisdom, worldly knowledge, there is something that is more prevalent than that, that's higher than that, that's even more intellectual than that. It's godly wisdom. Earthly wisdom has its limits, it has its limitations. Matter of fact, it may even make some things that are of God seem to be foolish. Turning the other cheek when someone tries to strike you, giving in the realization that you'll end up getting more. The more you give, the more you shall receive. That sounds like foolishness to the non-believer, to the person who has not been born again. Bible talks about one man, a scholar, in fact, who came to Jesus, the Bible says, by night. Man by the name of Nicodemus. Incidentally, he comes to Jesus by night, not necessarily because he's afraid of how someone will look at him for coming to Jesus when he can be seen in the daylight, but he goes to Jesus by night because that's when rabbis would study and meditate at night. So he wants to catch Jesus at a good time, and so he goes to him by night and talks about this matter, and inquires, I should say, about this matter of salvation. Jesus tells him, you must be born again. David says, born again, how can a man when he is old go back into his mother's womb? Jesus said, no, you're stuck on earthly wisdom, but I'm talking on a higher level. I've talked about godly wisdom. Marvel not that I say unto you, you must be born again. There are some things that some people just won't understand unless they're born into that realm. That's why you don't have to get discouraged, despondent. You've been witnessing to someone and they just don't seem to get it. Some things you have to be born into in order to receive. Let's look at a few more verses here. When you look at verses 20 and 21 again, in light of the fact that those who think they are wise often fail to see their wisdom as foolish and miss the preaching of the cross that can actually save them. Don't miss the fact that Christ died on the cross. That's a sign of weakness to earthly wisdom. But those of us that know its significance, it's not a sign of weakness. It's actually a sign of great strength and power. Christ came They did not take his life. He says, I'm laying my life down. I'm giving my life voluntarily. That's the sign of strength. You talk about real strength, real power. Let's look at verses 22 through 23 now. It's interesting how over the years and centuries, humanity has looked for signs and earthly wisdom, which actually can end up hindering some from believing the gospel. Let's read it here. The King James Version says, "For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness." Let me read a little bit further. "But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." Listen to the Messenger translation. It says, "While Jews clamor for miraculous demonstrations, and Greeks go in for philosophical wisdom, we go right on proclaiming Christ, the crucified. Jews treat this like an anti-miracle, and Greeks pass it off as absurd. But to us who are personally called by God himself, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is God's ultimate miracle and wisdom, all wrapped up in one. Human wisdom is so cheap, so impotent, next to the seeming absurdity of God, human strength can't begin to compete with God's weakness." I love it. I love it. Let me give you that 27th verse. The King James Version says, "But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty." That's awesome. That's awesome. That's awesome. What is Paul saying here? Paul is saying that only those who accept Christ, only those who have been born again, born into the kingdom, can understand God's power and his wisdom and realize that it is so much stronger than man's. Man has gotten caught up on himself. It's not just true with the church at Corinth then, but even with people today. It's no wonder that the highest percentage of drownings in the world are not of people that do not know how to swim, but by far the greatest number of drownings in the world are by people who already know how to swim. How can you explain that? Well, when a person knows how to swim, so often they will think that they can swim farther than they really can. They think they can swim longer than they really can, and so often they get out there and are not able to get back. Not able to get back. That's the way it is with the human's mind. So often we overestimate ourselves. But when you really come to know Christ, you recognize that, yeah, you can do all things, but it's only through him that we are able to do it. It is from him, in him, and through him we live and have our being. It is him that gives us our strength. And it's so interesting that he calls those, Paul says, and he is really the heart of the matter I think Paul is getting to. Paul says that the Lord calls those who even appear to be weak to others. Why in the world would the Lord do that? He does that so that we cannot take credit for ourselves. And so he calls those not necessarily who are already qualified, but the fact is he qualifies those whom he calls and enables them to do great things through him. It's in God's sovereignty that God calls so often those we would never expect him to call for his purpose, so that no man can take credit. It is because of God. Believers who are in Christ recognize we have everything we need, and that the more we exhibit what Christ has done for us, the more God the Father is glorified in the process. Let me give you those remaining scriptures for the lesson today that demonstrate just that. Messenger translation says, take a good look, verses 26 through 31. Take a good look, friends, at who you were when you got called into this life. I don't see many of the brightest and the best, Paul says, among you. Not many influential, not many from high society families. Isn't it obvious that God deliberately chose men and women that the culture overlooks and exploits? And he says, listen, even abuses. God chose these nobodies to expose the hollow pretensions of the somebodies. Lord have mercy, the somebodies. Did you catch that? He says, God, it's obvious God deliberately chose men and women that the culture overlooks, that the culture even exploits and abuses. God chose these nobodies, quote unquote, to expose the hollow pretension of those who think they are somebody, quote unquote. That makes it quite clear that none of you can get by with blowing your own horn before God. Everything that we have, right thinking and right living, a clean state and a fresh start, comes from God by way of Jesus Christ. He concludes this chapter by saying that's why we have the saying, if you're going to blow a horn, blow a trumpet for God. Thank God for his word. I pray that word blesses you this week. And we look forward to sharing with you on next week. Listen, you ought to read in advance. Next week, we'll be looking at 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verses 3 through 14. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 through 14, talking about stirring up the gift of God, stirring up the gift of God. I look forward to seeing you then. And till then, I'm Pastor A.T. Curry. Be blessed. I'm praying for you. God bless.